There are sounds in war that never leave you. The crack of a laser gun, the roar of a chainsword, the scream of drop pods tearing through atmosphere. But there is one sound that drowns out all others. One thunder that shakes the very bones of the galaxy. It is the voice of the Earthshaker cannon, and for those who serve these guns, it becomes the rhythm of their existence, the drumbeat of a life measured in shells fired and coordinates called, in targets obliterated, and ears that will never hear silence again. Welcome back to Stories of Hammer. Today, we descend into one of the most overlooked yet essential roles in the Astra Militarum, the grinding, brutal existence of the Basilisk artillery crewman. While infantry charge across no man's land and tank commanders lead armored spearheads into glory, the artillery crews wage a different kind of war. Theirs is a conflict of mathematics and munitions, of tonnage dropped and barrages sustained. A war where you never see your enemy's face, but know with cold certainty that you are sending them to their graves by the hundreds, by the thousands, with each trigger pull. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and war requires artillery, lots of it. The Basilisk self-propelled gun is the backbone of Imperial firepower, the most common artillery piece in the Astra Militarum arsenal, produced on every major forge world and deployed to every theater of war across the galaxy. Based on the reliable Chimera chassis, the Basilisk mounts the fearsome Earthshaker cannon, a weapon whose name is earned with every shot. This 132mm gun can hurl a 38-kilogram shell over 15 kilometers at a velocity of 814 meters per second. And it does so again and again and again until the barrel glows red and the crew's hands bleed and the target coordinates are nothing but smoking craters filled with the broken remnants of what once threatened the Imperium. But this is not a story about machines. This is a story about the men and women who serve them, who live and die in the shadow of these guns, whose names will never be spoken in the halls of glory, whose sacrifices will be tallied in ammunition expenditure reports rather than songs of valor. This is the story of the artillery crewman, the forgotten soldier whose war is measured in tons of high explosive and whose enemy is often nothing more than a set of coordinates on a data slate. The life of a Basilisk crewman is one of contradictions. They wield some of the most devastating firepower in the Imperial arsenal, yet they are among the most vulnerable soldiers on any battlefield. They can strike targets they will never see, destroying entire companies with clinical precision, yet they often die without ever facing their killers. They are essential to every major offensive, every siege, every sustained campaign, yet they receive a fraction of the recognition given to the infantry who advance behind, their barrage or the tank crews who exploit the breaches they create. To understand this life, we must first understand what it means to serve a gun that can level fortifications, shatter armor, and break the will of entire regiments with the scream of its incoming shells. We must understand the physical toll of working a weapon system that produces muzzle reports loud enough to permanently damage hearing, recoil powerful enough to tear muscles, and rates of fire demanding enough to leave hands blistered and backs screaming. We must understand the psychological weight of indirect fire, of killing at a distance, of never knowing if the coordinates you just obliterated held enemy combatants or civilian refugees who couldn't evacuate in time. The Basilisk crew typically consists of a commander, a gunner, a loader, and a driver, though crew compositions can vary by regiment and battlefield necessity. Each role is specialized, each position critical, and each member knows that their survival depends not just on their own competence, but on the seamless coordination of the entire team. The commander receives fire missions, calculates trajectories, and directs the crew. The gunner operates the aiming mechanisms, making minute adjustments to elevation and bearing based on rangefinder readings and command input. The loader handles the backbreaking work of moving shells from storage to breach again and again, shells that weigh more than a standard-issue lasgun and come in varieties from high explosive to incendiary to smoke. The driver keeps the vehicle positioned, ready to move at a moment's notice, because standing still in artillery warfare is asking for a counter-battery strike to erase you from existence. Most Basilisk variants feature an open-topped crew compartment, a design choice that maximizes the weapon's elevation angles and allows for maximum range, but leaves the crew horrifyingly exposed to everything from small arms fire to shrapnel from near misses to the chemical and biological weapons that turn the 41st Millennium's battlefields into nightmares beyond imagining. Some patterns, like the Armageddon variant, offer enclosed crew compartments, trading some range and firing arc for protection. But even these are only resistant to small arms, not the dedicated anti-armor weapons that enemy forces will inevitably direct at anything bearing the profile of an Imperial artillery piece. The crew lives with the knowledge that their vehicle is a target, that somewhere out there, enemy forward observers are trying to locate them, enemy artillery is trying to range them, enemy aircraft are hunting them, and enemy infiltrators are attempting to get close enough to plant demolition charges or simply execute the crew in their sleep. The Basilisk's thin armor, based on the already lightly protected Chimera chassis, means that weapons which would barely scratch a Lehman Russ battle tank will penetrate with ease. A direct hit from most anti-tank weapons means the crew has seconds to live, if that, before ammunition cooks off and the vehicle becomes a pyre that can be seen for kilometers. Yet despite these dangers, or perhaps because of them, artillery crews develop a fierce pride in their work. They are the Emperor's thunder, the long arm of Imperial vengeance, the means by which commanders project power far beyond the reach of small arms or even tank cannons. When infantry units are pinned down by enemy fire, it is the artillery that breaks the deadlock. When enemy armor concentrations threaten to overwhelm defensive positions, it is the artillery that disrupts their formations. When fortifications stand defiant against assault, it is the artillery that reduces them to rubble. The artilleryman knows his worth, even if others do not. Even if he dies with his name known only to his squad mates and the Munitorum clerks who cross it off the roster. Before we delve deeper into the daily existence of these crews, into the technical demands and physical horrors and psychological toll of their service, we must understand how one becomes an artillery crewman in the first place, because this is not a role for which most soldiers volunteer, and those who do often have no conception of what they are truly signing up for. The path to the artillery begins differently depending on one's regiment of origin. The Astra Militarum encompasses countless billions of soldiers drawn from millions of worlds, each with their own martial traditions, training doctrines, and specializations. Some worlds produce regiments famous for their infantry prowess. Others specialize in armored warfare. Still others, particularly those with strong industrial bases or traditions of siege warfare, produce regiments where artillery is not merely support, but the primary instrument of war. For a soldier from a standard infantry regiment, assignment to artillery often comes through a combination of aptitude testing, physical capability, and simple random chance. The Departamento Munitorum's inscrutable bureaucracy sorts billions of soldiers into millions of roles, and individual preferences rarely factor into these decisions. A recruit might have dreamed of glory in the infantry, of bayonet charges and close combat, only to find himself assigned to an artillery crew because his test scores indicated mathematical aptitude, or because casualties in artillery units required immediate replacement, and he happened to be available. The aptitude requirements for artillery service are different from those of infantry or armor. Raw physical strength matters less than endurance and the ability to perform repetitive heavy labor for extended periods. Intelligence matters, but not the tactical battlefield awareness of an infantry sergeant, rather the technical understanding needed to maintain complex firing mechanisms, to calculate firing solutions when automated systems fail, to understand the relationship between propellant charges and range, between elevation angles and trajectory. Hearing, ironically, matters little, because it will be destroyed soon enough, regardless of how acute it was at the start of service. What truly matters, what separates artillery crews from other combat arms, is the psychological capacity to kill at a distance, to deal death without witnessing its effects, to reduce lives to grid coordinates and tonnage calculations. The artillery crewman must be able to fire mission after mission, knowing that each shell is finding its target, that each impact is ending lives, yet maintaining the emotional distance necessary to continue functioning. This is not the hot-blooded violence of melee combat, or even the aim precision of rifle fire, where you see your target fall. This is industrial killing, warfare as mathematics, death as logistics. Training for artillery service varies wildly by regiment, but certain fundamentals remain constant. Recruits must learn the technical operation of their assigned weapon system, and for Basilisk crews, this means understanding the Earthshaker cannon in intimate detail. The Earthshaker is not a simple weapon. It is a complex piece of equipment with numerous adjustment mechanisms, safety interlocks, and maintenance requirements. The gun must be elevated to the proper angle, typically very high for indirect fire, traversed to the correct bearing, and loaded with the appropriate shell and propellant charge combination for the desired range and effect. The standard propellant load uses 5 charges, but 6 and 7 charge loads exist for extended range shots, though their use is carefully controlled because the additional stress they place on the gun barrel can lead to premature wear or even catastrophic failure. Authorization for overcharge shots comes from high command, and their use is logged meticulously because each weapon can only fire a limited number before the barrel must be replaced. And barrel replacement is not something that happens easily in active combat zones. The decision to use an overcharge round is always a calculation. Is the extended range worth the long-term degradation of the weapon? In the desperate wars of the 41st millennium, the answer is often yes, because tomorrow might never come, and the target that needs destroying exists today. Loading an Earthshaker is brutal physical work. The shells themselves weigh 38 kilograms each, and they must be lifted from the ammunition storage, which in a Basilisk is located in the vehicle's hull, carried to the breech, and loaded while the gun is elevated at steep angles. This is not a one-time effort, but a continuous cycle. A well-drilled crew can maintain a sustained rate of fire that keeps the gun speaking every few seconds during intensive barrages, though this pace cannot be maintained indefinitely before exhaustion sets in, or the weapon's mechanical components require cooling and inspection. The loader's job is perhaps the most physically demanding on the vehicle. Hour after hour, mission after mission, they are lifting, carrying, loading, repeating the cycle until their arms shake and their back screams and their hands are raw despite the heavy gloves that are supposed to protect them. The shells are not just heavy, they are awkward, and mishandling one can have consequences ranging from a crushed foot to a dropped round that damages its fuse and becomes a hazard to everyone nearby. In the chaos of combat, with the vehicle potentially moving, with enemy fire impacting nearby, with the gun's recoil shaking the entire platform, the loader must maintain their focus and their form, because a loading error can jam the breech, or worse, cause a partial or premature detonation that kills everyone in the crew compartment. Beyond the physical mechanics of operating the weapon, artillery training includes the science of indirect fire, the mathematics of trajectory and ballistics. While modern basilisks incorporate targeting cogitators and automated fire control systems, these devices can be damaged in combat, can malfunction due to the harsh conditions of warfare, or can simply be unavailable in regiments equipped with older vehicle variants. A competent crew must be able to operate their weapon even when automated systems fail, must be able to calculate range and bearing manually, must understand how wind, temperature, and even the rotation of the planet they are fighting on can affect shell flight. Forward observers, those brave or foolish souls who position themselves where they can see the target and call in corrections, are the artillery's eyes. The observer provides initial target coordinates, watches the fall of shot, and calls for adjustments left, right, add, drop, until rounds are landing on target. This process, called ranging, can take several shells before fire for effect is called, and the full weight of the battery is brought to bear. The relationship between artillery crews and their forward observers is one of absolute trust. The observer trusts that the crew will place rounds where called without dropping them on friendly positions. The crew trusts that the observer's coordinates are accurate and that the risk they are taking, firing mission after mission and potentially revealing their position to enemy counter-battery assets, is justified by the importance of the target. Counter-battery fire is the artillery crewman's nightmare. The enemy he cannot see, but knows is always hunting him. Just as Imperial artillery seeks to destroy enemy gun positions, enemy artillery seeks to destroy Imperial guns. The moment a Basilisk fires, it announces its position to anyone with the proper detection equipment. The muzzle flash is visible for kilometers. The sound carries even farther. More sophisticated enemies employ acoustic sensors that can triangulate firing positions from sound alone, or radar systems that can track shells back to their origin point. This means that the artillery is always playing a deadly game of cat and mouse. Fire, displace, fire from a new position, displace again. Standing still is death. Falling into predictable patterns is death. Failing to move quickly enough after a fire mission is death. Yet moving constantly is exhausting for the crew and wears on the vehicle's mechanical systems, and there are only so many pre-prepared firing positions in any given area. Sometimes, particularly in siege warfare or when defending fixed positions, displacement is not an option, and the crew must simply accept that they are in a known location and hope that their gun shields, concealment, and whatever cover they can scrape together will be enough when the counter-battery fire inevitably comes. The sound of incoming artillery is distinctive and terrifying. That particular whistle, rising in pitch as the shell approaches, provides perhaps seconds of warning. Experienced crews learn to judge by sound whether incoming fire is going to land close or far, but this knowledge is cold comfort when you realize the shells are coming down on your position. There is no effective cover inside a Basilisk against a direct hit from another artillery piece. The thin armor that might deflect small arms fire or shell fragments is meaningless against the concentrated explosive power of a 132mm or larger shell designed to destroy fortifications and vehicles. When incoming fire is detected, the crew's options are limited. If the vehicle is mobile and the engine is running, the driver might be able to move out of the impact zone, but this assumes they have both warning time and a clear path of escape. More often, the crew simply takes whatever cover they can find, huddling behind the vehicle or in any available depression in the ground, and prays to the Emperor that the shells land anywhere but directly on top of them. The moments between hearing incoming fire and impact are among the longest in any soldier's experience. Seconds that stretch into seeming eternities while you wait to discover if you will live or die, if you will emerge from this barrage whole or maimed, if your crewmates will be beside you when the bombardment ends or scattered across the landscape in pieces too small to identify. Artillery crews become intimately familiar with the concept of random chance determining survival. Two basilisks, positioned 50 meters apart, might experience completely different fates during an enemy barrage. One might be obliterated by a direct hit, while the other escapes without a scratch, simply because the enemy's shells fell 5 meters to the left instead of 5 meters to the right. There is no skill involved in this survival, no tactical brilliance, no superior training. There is only chance, and the knowledge that chance is no respecter of competence or courage or faith. This randomness affects crews in different ways. Some develop elaborate superstitions, rituals they must perform before each firing, mission, lucky charms they wear, or prayers they recite. Anything to create the illusion of control over forces that are fundamentally beyond their influence. Others embrace fatalism, accepting that their survival is entirely in the Emperor's hands and that worrying about it serves no purpose. Still others carry the stress internally, letting it build until it emerges as nightmares, as tremors that come when the guns finally fall silent, as the 1,000-yard stare that marks soldiers who have seen too much and simply cannot process anymore. The daily routine of a Basilisk crew in active operations is built around the gun. Everything serves the gun, everything maintains the gun, everything protects the gun so that it can continue performing its mission. This is not a 9-to-5 existence. Artillery operates on a 24-hour cycle because wars do not pause for sleep, and the Emperor's enemies do not conveniently stop being threats when human circadian rhythms demand rest. A typical day, insofar as anything can be typical in the chaos of warfare, begins with maintenance. The Earthshaker cannon is a precision instrument despite its massive size and brutal function, and it requires constant care. The crew chief conducts inspections of the barrel, looking for cracks or excessive wear that might indicate the weapon is approaching the end of its safe service life. The recoil systems must be checked, because a failure here could result in the gun tearing itself free from its mount during firing. Elevation and traverse mechanisms must be lubricated and tested. Ammunition must be inventoried, shells examined for damage or deterioration, propellant charges stored properly in waterproof containers away from heat sources and sparks. The vehicle itself requires maintenance beyond just the weapon system. The Chimera chassis is reliable by Imperial standards, which means it requires constant attention to keep it functioning in the harsh conditions of the battlefield. Tracks must be inspected and adjusted. Road wheels must be greased. The engine, that sturdy Vulcan or Patton biogas power plant that can run on virtually any combustible material, must be serviced. Fuel must be sourced, which in extended campaigns can mean using whatever local combustibles are available when standard Promethium supplies are exhausted. Crews have been known to run their vehicles on rendered enemy corpse fat, on distilled alcohol looted from destroyed settlements, on anything that will burn when orthodox fuel is unavailable. Living conditions for artillery crews vary dramatically based on the theatre of operations and the current tactical situation. In well-established artillery parks behind stable front lines, crews might have actual tents or even prefabricated shelters, might receive regular hot meals from field kitchens, might enjoy the relative luxury of being able to sleep for more than a few hours at a time without expecting to be awakened by incoming fire. These situations are the exception rather than the rule. More commonly, the crew lives in, on, and around their vehicle. The Basilisk has no troop compartment, no space for sleeping or storing personal effects. The crew sleeps on the ground beneath the vehicle or in shallow scrapes they dig for themselves, hoping the Basilisk's bulk will provide some shelter from wind and weather, and that its armor, thin as it is, might stop shell fragments if something impacts nearby. Personal possessions are minimal because there is nowhere to keep them. A change of clothes if you are fortunate, prayer books and icons of the Emperor, perhaps a few letters from home that you read until they fall apart, and little else. Food for artillery crews is whatever the Munitorum supply chain provides, which can range from decent ration packs to fungus-based protein slabs that taste like recycled boots, and probably are recycled boots, mixed with enough preservatives to survive transit across multiple star systems. In prolonged engagements, especially sieges that stretch across months or years, fresh food becomes a distant memory, and crews subsist on rations that meet the technical definition of nutritionally complete, while providing absolutely no joy in consumption. The joke among guardsmen is that Munitorum rations are designed to be barely preferable to starvation, which keeps soldiers motivated to win the war quickly so they can return to real food. The reality is that rations are designed to be cheap to produce in apocalyptic quantities and stable enough to remain edible for decades if necessary, and flavor is simply not a consideration. Water is often more valuable than food. Clean water, drinking water that won't give you a bacterial infection or chemical poisoning, is a constant concern on contaminated battlefields. Artillery positions, often located in areas that have been subjected to repeated bombardment, are typically toxic environments. Shell impacts churn the soil, releasing ancient pollutants. Chemical weapons leave residues that leach into groundwater. Bodies, human and otherwise, rot in shell craters and contaminate everything around them. Artillery crews learn to boil water, to use purification tablets despite their foul taste, to drink as little as possible, and to piss even less frequently, because dehydration is preferable to whatever parasites or toxins might be lurking in the local water supply. Hygiene becomes aspirational rather than achievable. There are no showers at artillery positions, no bathing facilities beyond whatever water can be spared, and a rag to scrub yourself with. Crews go days or weeks without proper washing. Their uniforms become caked with powder residue from the guns, with mud from the firing positions, with blood from various minor injuries and major wounds, with the general filth that accumulates when humans live in unsanitary conditions. The smell of an artillery battery after extended operations is something that defies description, a combination of unwashed bodies, propellant chemicals, spilled promethium, rotting trash, human waste, and the distinctive metallic tang that comes from areas where large amounts of blood have been spilled. Yet despite these conditions, or perhaps because survival requires it, crews maintain their equipment meticulously. The gun must be clean even if the crew is filthy. The ammunition must be protected even if the crew sleeps in the rain. The vehicle must be serviced even if the crew is exhausted to the point of collapse. This is not just military discipline, though that certainly plays a role. This is survival instinct. The crew knows that their lives depend on the weapon functioning when needed, and they would rather skip sleep, skip meals, skip anything else, than risk a malfunction during a critical fire mission. The hierarchy within an artillery crew is less formal than in infantry units, but no less important. The crew chief, typically a sergeant or equivalent rank, has ultimate responsibility for the vehicle and crew. Their experience is what keeps everyone alive. They know how to read the tactical situation, when to fire and when to displace, when to risk extended firing sequences, and when to limit shots to minimize detection. They know the gun's capabilities and limitations intimately, can tell by sound when something is not quite right with the mechanism, can judge barrel wear by eye and make the call on whether an overcharged shot risks catastrophic failure. The gunner is the crew's technical specialist, the one who translates fire missions into precise mechanical adjustments. A skilled gunner can compensate for imperfect data, can make educated guesses when information is incomplete, can place rounds on target when equipment failures force manual operation. Gunners develop an almost intuitive feel for their weapon, learning its quirks and tendencies, knowing that this particular gun tends to shoot slightly left, that it requires a little extra elevation for maximum range shots, that the traverse mechanism sticks at certain angles and must be worked through rather than forced. The loader has perhaps the most dangerous job, because they are the one in closest physical proximity to the ammunition throughout the firing process. They handle the shells constantly, inserting them into the breech with the fuse already armed, knowing that a fumble or a mechanical failure could mean detonation at point-blank range. Loaders develop powerful arms and backs from the constant heavy lifting, and they develop an equally powerful sense of pride in their speed and efficiency. A fast loader means more rounds downrange, which means more effective fire support, which means more enemies dead and more friendlies alive, and that is all the motivation most loaders need to push through the pain and exhaustion. The driver, while seemingly less involved in the actual firing process, is critical to the crew's survival. They must position the vehicle precisely, often backing it into pre-prepared firing positions, with minimal clearance on either side, getting the gun exactly where it needs to be for optimal fields of fire. They must maintain situational awareness of escape routes and threats, while the rest of the crew is focused on the fire mission. When displacement is ordered, the driver must get the multi-ton vehicle moving immediately, must navigate terrain that might include shell craters, rubble, destroyed vehicles, and bodies, all while potentially under fire. The relationships between crew members are forged under conditions that would break most civilian bonds. These are people who live in each other's pockets, who share every hardship, who depend on each other for survival in the most literal sense. They know each other's strengths and weaknesses, their fears and hopes, their habits and quirks. They develop communication that goes beyond words, the kind of wordless coordination that comes from performing the same tasks together hundreds or thousands of times. Yet these relationships are also fragile because death is always present. Crews try not to get too attached, try to maintain some emotional distance because the next counter-battery strike or air raid or infiltrator attack could kill one or more of them. And grief is a luxury that soldiers in active combat cannot afford. This creates a strange dynamic where crew members are simultaneously closer than family and yet maintain barriers that families never would, a contradiction that is simply part of life in the artillery. When fire missions are called, everything changes. The leisurely pace of maintenance and position improvement gives way to controlled chaos as the crew springs into action. Fire mission coordinates come through on the Vox, passed from fire control to the crew chief, who relays them to the gunner. Range and bearing are calculated. The gun is traversed and elevated. The loader prepares the first shell, and then the commander gives the word, and the gunner pulls the firing lanyard, and the earthshaker speaks. The sound and fury of the earthshaker firing is something that must be experienced to be understood, and it is an experience that changes those who live through it repeatedly. The muzzle blast is not just loud, it is physically violent. The pressure wave hits like a fist, making your chest compress and your ears ring, even through hearing protection that is nominally rated for the weapon. The recoil rocks the entire vehicle backward on its suspension, the gun's mass sliding back against its hydraulic buffers with a mechanical shriek that adds to the cacophony. Flames shoot from the muzzle, a brilliant flash visible for kilometers that temporarily blinds anyone looking directly at it. The smell of burned propellant floods the area, a harsh chemical scent that coats the back of your throat and makes you cough. And then, before the crew has even processed the first shot, the process begins again. Load. Adjust if fire control calls for corrections. Fire. The cycle repeats, building into a rhythm that becomes hypnotic despite the violence of each shot. During sustained barrages, the gun fires again and again, the loader working frantically to keep up with the demanded rate of fire, the crew chief calling out corrections based on observer reports, the gunner making minute adjustments, the gun speaking its thunder into the sky with mechanical regularity. The physical toll of this sustained firing is immense. The loader's arms burn with lactic acid buildup from the constant lifting. The gunner's shoulders ache from working the elevation and traverse wheels. Everyone's ears ring despite protection, the sound of the gun seeming to bypass physical barriers and resonate directly in bone and skull. The propellant gases irritate eyes and throats. The heat from the gun barrel, radiating outward as metal temperatures climb, makes the crew compartment an oven. Brass from the propellant charges litters the deck, hot enough to burn exposed skin. Yet the crew continues because the mission demands it. Because somewhere out there, Imperial forces are counting on this fire support. Because the coordinates they are striking represent threats that must be eliminated, or positions that must be denied to the enemy. The crew does not see the results of their fire. They do not witness the shells landing, the explosions that tear through enemy formations, the destruction wrought by their weapon. They see only data, coordinates, numbers, the abstract mathematics of warfare. This disconnection from the human cost of their actions is both a blessing and a curse. It is a blessing because it allows the crew to function without the psychological burden of witnessing mass death inflicted by their hands. The infantry sergeant who orders his squad to gun down enemy soldiers sees them fall, sees the blood and hears the screams, carries those images with him. The artillery crewman sees none of that. He fires at coordinates. What happens at those coordinates is abstract, theoretical, someone else's problem to witness and remember. But it is also a curse, because the disconnection never feels complete. The crew knows what they are doing. They understand that every shell they fire is designed to kill, that the high explosive rounds are optimized for maximum fragmentation and blast effect, that the incendiary rounds burn hot enough to melt ceramite, that even the smoke rounds can kill if someone is close enough to the impact point. They know that the coordinates they are striking often represent not just enemy soldiers, but also whatever structure or terrain feature those enemies were occupying, which might include civilians who failed to evacuate, or prisoners who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or fellow guardsmen if the coordinates were wrong, or the gun malfunctioned, or any of 1,000 things went wrong. This knowledge creates a psychological burden that manifests differently in different crew members. Some rationalize it as the necessary cost of war, accepting that innocent casualties are inevitable and that fretting over them serves no purpose. Some develop elaborate justifications, telling themselves that anyone at the target coordinates must have been an enemy or an enemy sympathizer, or at least someone who failed to remove themselves from a war zone. Some simply stop thinking about it, developing a mental compartmentalization that separates the mechanical act of loading and firing from any consideration of what those actions achieve downrange. Others are not so fortunate. They develop persistent doubts, questions that erode their certainty even as they continue performing their duties. What if the coordinates were wrong? What if the target had already moved? What if those were refugees we just shelled, not enemy forces? These questions have no answers, or at least no answers that can be verified, and they fester in the mind, creating stress that accumulates over time and emerges in various dysfunctions. The artillery crews of the death corps of Krieg represent an extreme case of specialization and adaptation to the demands of artillery warfare, and their example illustrates both the effectiveness of total dedication to the artillery mission and the human cost of that dedication. Krieg is a world that died by atomic fire and was rebuilt by survivors who internalized guilt for their world's rebellion so deeply that they made atonement through suffering into a cultural cornerstone. The Death Corps regiments raised on Krieg are famous throughout the Imperium for their willingness to accept casualties that other regiments would consider suicidal, for their expertise in siege and trench warfare, and for their absolutely emotionless prosecution of imperial justice through overwhelming firepower. Artillery is central to Krieg doctrine in a way that is unusual even by Imperial Guard standards. While most regiments view artillery as important fire support, Krieg regiments build entire campaigns around artillery superiority. Their artillery companies are larger, better equipped, and more extensively trained than those of most other regiments. A Krieg siege army deploys artillery in apocalyptic quantities, batteries upon batteries of Earthshaker cannons, and Medusa siege guns and bombards, all coordinated to deliver rolling barrages that precede infantry advances and sustained bombardments that reduce enemy fortifications to rubble over weeks or months. Krieg artillery crews are trained from childhood for their roles. The VT womb programs that produce most of the Death Corps' replacement soldiers include specialized tracks for different military occupations, and those selected for artillery receive education focused on mathematics, ballistics, and mechanical operation from the moment their education begins. They practice on equipment that simulates real weapons. They study recorded fire missions from past campaigns. They internalize the doctrine and procedures until they can execute them without conscious thought. The result is artillery crews of surpassing technical proficiency who can maintain punishing rates of fire for extended periods, who can operate their weapons in the most hostile environments imaginable, and who view their own survival as secondary to mission accomplishment. A Krieg artillery crew will continue firing even when under direct attack, even when their position is being overrun, even when escape is possible but would mean abandoning the gun. They will fire until the gun is disabled, or they are dead, whichever comes first, because retreat is not part of their psychological programming. This makes them extraordinarily effective and extraordinarily expendable. Krieg artillery units are deployed to the worst sieges, the most grinding attritional campaigns, the places where victory is measured in meters gained per month, and casualties are measured in percentages of total force strength. They are expected to absorb horrific losses and continue functioning, and they do, because Krieg can produce replacement soldiers faster than most enemies can kill them. But effectiveness comes with a cost that is rarely tallied in official reports. Krieg artillery crews experience casualty rates that would break the morale of most regiments. They operate in toxic environments without adequate protection because protective equipment would slow them down, and mission accomplishment matters more than crew health. They sustain permanent injuries from their weapons, from overwork, from exposure to chemical and biological agents, and they continue serving until they physically cannot, at which point they are either reassigned to less demanding duties or given the Emperor's Peace with a bolt round to the head. The hearing loss that affects all artillery crews is universal and irreversible among Krieg gunners. The tremors that come from the constant physical strain of loading heavy shells are worn as badges of honor. The lung damage from breathing propellant gases and toxic air is accepted as the inevitable cost of service. Krieg produces soldiers who will sacrifice not just their lives, but their health, their sanity, and their humanity to accomplish the mission. And nowhere is this more evident than in their artillery corps. The psychological conditioning that allows this level of sacrifice also prevents Krieg soldiers from forming the kinds of bonds that sustain soldiers from other regiments. Krieg artillery crews work together with flawless coordination, but they do not form friendships in any meaningful sense. They are numbers, designations, replaceable components in a war machine, and they relate to each other primarily through their functional roles rather than as individuals. When a crew member dies, the survivors request a replacement with the same emotional affect they would use to request replacement ammunition, a purely mechanical transaction devoid of grief or sentiment. This approach is effective for maintaining operational capability in the face of catastrophic losses, but it creates soldiers who are psychologically damaged in ways that most humans would find deeply disturbing. Krieg artillery crews do not celebrate victories. They do not mourn defeats. They simply continue firing, mission after mission, until the war is won or they are dead, experiencing neither hope nor despair, just the mechanical execution of their duty. The grim efficiency of Krieg artillery doctrine has influenced how other regiments approach artillery warfare, particularly those engaged in extended siege operations. But most regiments lack both the industrial capacity to produce soldiers at Krieg's rate and the psychological conditioning infrastructure to create soldiers willing to embrace such total self-abnegation. For most Imperial Guard artillery crews, the horrors of their service are ameliorated somewhat by human connection, by the bonds they form with their crewmates, by the hope that they might survive to see peace, or at least retirement. When artillery positions come under attack, the crew's vulnerability becomes painfully apparent. The Basilisk is not built for close combat. Its armor is designed to resist fragments and small arms, not dedicated anti-tank weapons or direct assault. Its heavy bolter, the only defensive weapon most variants carry, is intended for suppressing enemy scouts or dealing with light infantry, not repelling determined attacks. When serious threats close with an artillery position, the crew's survival depends on factors largely beyond their control. The first line of defense for any artillery battery is supposed to be distance and concealment. The guns should be far enough behind the front lines that enemy assault troops cannot easily reach them. They should be positioned in defilade or behind terrain features that mask them from direct observation. They should be camouflaged to reduce their visual signature. But in the chaos of modern warfare, especially when breakthroughs occur or when enemy forces employ infiltration tactics, these precautions are not always sufficient. Enemy aircraft represent one of the most significant threats to artillery positions. A Basilisk is a large, relatively immobile target with thin armor, exactly the kind of target that ground attack aircraft are designed to eliminate. When enemy planes appear overhead, the crew's options are extremely limited. The heavy bolter can engage aircraft, but hitting a fast-moving target with what is essentially a heavy machine gun requires either exceptional skill or tremendous luck. Most of the time, the crew can only take cover and hope that the pilot's bombs or rockets miss by a wide enough margin. The seconds between spotting incoming aircraft and the moment their weapons release are filled with helpless terror. You see them coming, hear the engines growing louder, and you know that in moments your position will be bracketed by explosions, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to prevent it. Some aircraft carry precision weapons, guided munitions that can strike individual vehicles. Others simply carpet an area with bombs or rockets, saturating the artillery park with explosives and trusting that some will find their targets. The aftermath of an airstrike on an artillery position is carnage on a scale that defies description. Vehicles are overturned, burning fiercely as their ammunition cooks off in secondary explosions. Crew members who are caught in the open are simply gone, vaporized by direct hits or shredded by fragmentation. Others are wounded, their bodies broken by blast overpressure or torn by shrapnel, and they scream for aid that may not come because the medici are overwhelmed or dead themselves. Ground infiltrators present a different kind of threat. Enemy special forces, scouts, or commandos that manage to penetrate to the artillery positions can cause destruction out of proportion to their numbers. A small team armed with demolition charges can disable or destroy multiple guns before they are detected and eliminated. Snipers can pick off crew members from concealed positions, slowly degrading the battery's capability to function. In the worst cases, infiltrators achieve complete surprise and massacre sleeping crews before any alarm can be raised. Artillery crews are taught basic infantry tactics: how to clear their immediate area, how to establish defensive perimeters, how to fight if they must. But they are not infantry specialists, and when enemy assault troops engineered for close combat hit an artillery position, the outcome is rarely in doubt. The crew can fire their heavy bolter, they can discharge their sidearms, they can even attempt to physically defend their position, but they are outmatched by soldiers whose entire purpose is violent close-range combat. Some crews, recognizing that their position is being overrun and that survival is impossible, make the decision to destroy their own equipment rather than let it fall into enemy hands. This means setting demolition charges on the breech mechanism or loading a shell backward and firing the gun, deliberately causing a catastrophic failure that renders the weapon permanently inoperable. It is a desperate measure taken only when capture seems certain, because explaining the deliberate destruction of Imperial equipment to the Commissariat is almost as dangerous as facing enemy assault troops. The psychological impact of being in an artillery crew that comes under direct attack is profound and lasting. For soldiers who are accustomed to dealing death at a distance, to being the hunters rather than the hunted, the experience of being targeted for destruction is deeply disturbing. The illusion of safety that distance provides is shattered, replaced by the visceral understanding that you are just as vulnerable as any other soldier on the battlefield, perhaps more so given your poor defensive capabilities. Crews that survive attacks often develop hypervigilance, an inability to relax even in supposedly safe rear areas because they have learned through bitter experience that nowhere is truly safe. They startle at unexpected sounds, scan the sky constantly for aircraft, and experience intrusive thoughts about what they would do if attackers appeared at this moment. Sleep becomes difficult, both because of the anxiety these thoughts provoke, and because nightmares replay the attacks they have experienced or imagine worse ones that might come. The physical injuries that artillery crewmen sustain are numerous and varied, ranging from the chronic damage inflicted by the job itself to the acute trauma of combat wounds. Even in the absence of enemy action, working an artillery piece takes a terrible toll on the human body. Hearing damage is universal and progressive, The Earthshaker cannon produces muzzle reports in excess of 180 decibels, loud enough to cause immediate, permanent damage to unprotected ears. Hearing protection is issued, foam plugs or mechanical dampeners that are supposed to reduce the sound to safer levels, but protection is never complete. The pressure waves from firing seem to bypass physical barriers, conducting through bone and tissue to damage the delicate structures of the inner ear. Tinnitus, the constant ringing or buzzing in the ears, is so common among artillery crews that it is simply accepted as an occupational hazard. Young crew members might still have relatively functional hearing after a few months of service, though they already struggle to understand speech in noisy environments. Veterans of years of artillery service often have profound hearing loss, able to perceive only the loudest sounds and completely unable to understand speech without lip reading or written communication. Some crews develop their own sign language, hand signals that allow them to communicate when verbal orders would be impossible to hear. This hearing loss extends beyond mere inconvenience. It impacts every aspect of a soldier's life and can become a liability in combat situations where audio cues provide critical information about threats. An artillery crewman who cannot hear approaching aircraft or the sound of incoming shells is at severe disadvantage, dependent entirely on visual observation and whatever warnings his fellow crew members can provide. In practical terms, severe hearing loss ends a soldier's usefulness in most combat roles, though artillery crews often continue serving because their role requires less acute hearing than infantry or armor positions. The constant physical strain of loading heavy shells creates chronic damage to muscles, joints, and connective tissue. Loaders develop back problems, herniated discs from the repetitive lifting of awkward loads, and shoulder injuries from the forces involved in loading while the gun is at steep elevation, angles. These injuries are cumulative, building over time until every loading cycle causes pain, and eventually the pain becomes so severe or the injury so debilitating that the soldier can no longer perform their duties. The Munitorum's response to injured soldiers varies by theatre and by how desperately replacements are needed. In some cases, injured crew members are given medical treatment and reassignment to less physically demanding roles. In others, they are given pain suppressants and ordered to continue serving until they literally cannot function. In the worst cases, particularly in regiments like the Death Corps, where individual soldier welfare is subordinate to mission accomplishment, injured crew members who can no longer perform are simply executed to free up rations and equipment for their replacements. Chemical and biological exposure is another chronic health hazard for artillery crews. The propellant used in artillery ammunition produces toxic combustion products, particularly when using the higher charge loads. Repeated exposure to these gases causes respiratory damage, chronic coughing, and increased susceptibility to lung infections. On worlds where chemical or biological weapons have been employed, where the very air is poison, artillery crews operating from open-topped vehicles suffer even more severe effects. Some regiments issue rebreathers or gas masks, protective equipment that filters the air and reduces exposure to toxins. But this equipment is uncomfortable, makes communication difficult, and can become a liability if it fails at a critical moment. Many crew members choose to operate without protection or to remove it as soon as conditions seem to improve, a decision that provides immediate comfort at the cost of long-term health damage. The acute injuries from enemy action are more dramatic but not necessarily more devastating than the chronic damage of the job. Shrapnel wounds are common when enemy fire lands near artillery positions. High-velocity fragments from exploding shells can penetrate flesh and bone, causing injuries that range from minor lacerations to amputations and fatal hemorrhaging. Artillery crews learn basic first aid because medical support is often limited, and delay in treating serious wounds can be fatal. Burns are another frequent injury, both from enemy weapons like flamers or plasma guns, and from accidents with the artillery piece itself. The gun barrel becomes hot enough during sustained firing to cause severe burns on contact, and crew members working around the weapon must be constantly aware of where hot metal surfaces are. propellant bags can ignite if mishandled, causing flash fires that sear exposed skin. Vehicles that take hits and catch fire become death traps, the crew having only seconds to escape before ammunition cooks off. The most catastrophic injuries occur when the artillery piece itself fails, or when ammunition detonates prematurely. A breech explosion caused by a manufacturing defect or excessive wear or improper loading can kill everyone in the crew compartment instantly. The explosion is contained and directed by the thick steel of the gun, channeling the blast force into the crew area with devastating effect. Bodies are found still at their positions, killed so quickly they had no time to react. Even crew members who survive catastrophic failures are often left with injuries that end their military service. Severe burns covering large portions of the body, amputations from blast trauma, internal injuries from overpressure waves, traumatic brain injuries that leave cognitive function permanently impaired. The Munitorum treats those it can and pensions off those it cannot, though a pension in the Imperium is often barely enough to subsist on, assuming the soldier survives long enough to collect it and is not simply abandoned when their usefulness ends. The psychological toll of artillery service accumulates alongside the physical damage, and in many ways is even more insidious because it is less visible and less acknowledged. The Astra Militarum, as an organization, does not formally recognize concepts like post-traumatic stress or combat fatigue, treating psychological casualties as either weakness to be purged or malingering to be punished. Yet the reality is that artillery crewmen develop psychological symptoms at rates that would alarm any objective observer, symptoms that degrade their effectiveness and diminish their quality of life, but which must be hidden or ignored because admitting to psychological distress can result in execution for cowardice or desertion. The disconnection between action and consequence that indirect fire creates produces a particular kind of psychological distress. The crew knows intellectually that they are killing, that every shell they fire is designed to end lives, but they never see the results. This creates a cognitive dissonance, a split between intellectual knowledge and emotional experience that prevents normal emotional processing of what is essentially industrial-scale killing. Some crew members develop intrusive thoughts about their targets, imaginations that fill in the gaps their eyes never witnessed. They envision enemy soldiers obliterated by their shells, see in their mind's eye the blast waves and fragmentation and the human bodies torn apart. Some imagine worse, civilians who were in the wrong place, children who were sheltering in buildings that became targeting coordinates. These thoughts are unbidden and unwelcome, but they persist, particularly during the rare moments of quiet when there are no immediate tasks to occupy the mind. Others develop emotional numbing, a flattening of affect where nothing seems to provoke strong feelings anymore. The joy and sorrow and fear and anger that characterized their pre-service existence fades, replaced by a grey emotional landscape where the extremes of human experience barely register. This numbing serves a protective function, preventing overwhelming emotions from interfering with duty performance, but it also impairs the soldier's ability to connect with others or to find meaning in anything beyond the immediate tactical situation. Sleep disturbances are nearly universal among artillery crews in active operations. The irregular schedule of fire missions, the constant background noise of a war zone, the anxiety about potential attacks, all contribute to chronic sleep deprivation. Even when opportunities for sleep exist, crews often find themselves unable to take advantage, too keyed up with adrenaline, or too anxious about threats to relax enough for actual rest. When sleep does come, it is often plagued by nightmares, replays of attacks experienced, or fears of attacks to come, waking the sleeper in a cold sweat with heart pounding. The cumulative effect of chronic sleep deprivation is severe. Cognitive function degrades, reaction time slow, judgment becomes impaired. Crew members make mistakes they would never make when well-rested, potentially fatal errors in weapon operation or tactical decision-making. Tempers fray and interpersonal conflicts arise over minor issues. Physical health suffers as the body lacks adequate time for recovery and repair. Yet the operational tempo often does not allow for adequate rest, and crews are expected to continue functioning regardless of their exhaustion. Alcohol and other substances offer temporary respite from the psychological burden, and they are widely used when available, despite official prohibitions. Artillery crews in rear areas often spend their off-duty time drinking whatever alcohol they can obtain, from sanctioned rations to locally distilled spirits of dubious safety to stolen sacramental wine from destroyed churches. The goal is oblivion, a few hours where the mind is too foggy to remember or worry or fear. The hangovers are brutal, and performance while intoxicated is compromised, but for many crew members, the temporary escape seems worth any cost. Some regiments tacitly tolerate this substance use, recognizing that soldiers need some outlet for their stress and that attempting to enforce total prohibition would be counterproductive. Others crack down hard, viewing any intoxication as a failure of discipline that must be punished severely. The latter approach typically drives the behavior underground rather than eliminating it, creating a situation where crews engage in the same drinking, but now must also worry about concealing it from commissars and officers. Faith in the Emperor is supposed to provide psychological comfort, to give meaning to suffering and purpose to sacrifice. For some artillery crewmen, this works. They find genuine solace in prayer, in the rituals of the imperial cult, in the belief that their service is holy and their sacrifices are known to the God Emperor of mankind. They wear their suffering as a form of worship, offering their pain to the Golden Throne and trusting that their faithfulness will be rewarded in the afterlife, if not in their current existence. Others struggle with their faith. How can a benevolent emperor allow such suffering? How can their service be holy when it involves such extensive killing, often of people whose only crime was being in the wrong place when the coordinates were called? The existence of chaos, of malevolent entities that feast on negative emotions and twist faith into corruption, makes the question even more complicated because doubt itself can be a vector for spiritual contamination. The ecclesiarchy's answer to these questions is typically to condemn them as heretical rather than to engage with their substance. Doubt is weakness. Questioning is the first step toward damnation. Faith must be absolute and unquestioning, and soldiers who cannot achieve this are failures whose contamination must be purged from the ranks. This approach provides clarity but no comfort, and it drives many troubled soldiers to conceal their doubts rather than resolve them, which only deepens their psychological distress. Commissars attached to artillery batteries serve as a visible reminder that discipline is maintained through fear as much as through faith. The commissar has authority to execute any soldier for cowardice, for incompetence, for questioning orders, for any behavior deemed prejudicial to unit cohesion or mission accomplishment. This creates an environment where crew members are terrified not just of the enemy, but of their own command structure, where a moment of weakness or a carelessly spoken doubt can result in summary execution. Some commissars are relatively restrained, executing only in the most extreme cases of actual cowardice or insubordination. Others are zealots who see purging weakness as their primary function, who shoot soldiers for infractions that other commissars would handle with verbal reprimands or extra duties. The arbitrary nature of commissariat justice means that soldiers never quite know where the line is, which creates constant background anxiety about whether something they say or do will be deemed worthy of execution. After months or years of artillery service, assuming the crew member survives that long, they often emerge as fundamentally changed people. The cheerful recruit who entered service with idealistic notions about defending humanity has been ground down by the realities of industrialized warfare into something harder and more cynical. They have learned that war is not glorious adventure, but rather ugly, grinding, deeply unglamorous work that destroys bodies and minds with equal efficiency. Some wear this change as armor, embracing their hardness as necessary adaptation to a harsh reality. They become the grizzled veterans who train new crews, who pass on the technical knowledge and tactical wisdom needed to survive, who maintain the traditions and pride of the artillery service, even while harboring no illusions about its nature. These veterans are invaluable to artillery units, the institutional memory that keeps batteries functioning when so much other knowledge is lost to casualties and turnover. Others break under the accumulated strain. They develop symptoms that can no longer be hidden or ignored, obvious psychological deterioration that marks them as no longer fit for service. The lucky ones are sent to rear area hospitals or given medical discharges. The unlucky ones are executed by commissars who view psychological breakdown as equivalent to cowardice. The majority fall somewhere in between, declining into barely functional states where they go through the motions of their duties, but have essentially checked out mentally. The casualty rates among artillery crews vary dramatically by theatre and by the specific tactical situation, but are generally higher than often assumed. Artillery positions are priority targets for any enemy with the capability to strike them. Casualties from counter-battery fire, from airstrikes, from infiltrator attacks, from simple accidents during extended operations, all accumulate steadily. A battery that starts a campaign at full strength will often be at half strength or less within months, requiring constant influx of replacement crews. These replacements, fresh from training or transferred from other units, must be integrated into existing crews quickly, often under combat conditions. They arrive with theoretical knowledge, but without the hard-won experience that separates functional crews from exceptional ones. The veterans teach them, when time and circumstances allow, but often replacements must learn through trial and error, and errors in artillery service are frequently fatal. The constant turnover prevents the development of the kind of unit cohesion that characterizes elite infantry formations. Artillery crews change composition regularly as members are killed, wounded, or transferred. The relationships between crew members, while intense during their time together, are often transient. This creates an emotional distance, a reluctance to form deep bonds with people who statistically will not be there next month, which further contributes to the isolation and psychological strain of artillery service. Despite all these hardships, or perhaps because of them, artillery crews develop a fierce pride in their role. They are the God Emperor's thunder, the long arm of imperial vengeance, the means by which commanders project overwhelming firepower across distances that other weapons cannot reach. They know that infantry advances are possible only because artillery has suppressed enemy positions. They know that breakthroughs are exploitable only because artillery has disrupted enemy attempts to reinforce. They know that sieges are winnable only because artillery can reduce fortifications to rubble. This knowledge sustains them through the hardships. When the loader's arms are shaking from exhaustion and the gunner's ears are ringing, and the commander is calculating whether they have time for one more fire mission before they must displace to avoid counter-battery fire, they push through because they understand that their work matters. Somewhere out there, Imperial Guardsmen are depending on this fire support. Somewhere out there, the Emperor's enemies are dying because these crew members are doing their jobs. Artillery traditions and ceremonies help maintain unit identity and morale. Batteries develop their own customs, rituals performed before major operations or after successful fire missions, songs sung while maintaining equipment, stories told about past glories and past crew members who distinguished themselves. These traditions link current crews to the long history of Imperial artillery, to the thousands of gun crews who served before them and the thousands who will serve after, creating a sense of continuity that transcends any individual soldier's service. Awards and decorations, when they are given, mean a great deal to artillery crews precisely because they are so rare. Artillery service is not the kind of warfare that lends itself to individual heroism in the traditional sense. There are few opportunities for the dramatic actions that earn commendations. Success is measured in missions completed, in targets destroyed, in supporting infantry that successfully accomplished their objectives. Yet occasionally, a crew's actions are recognized, a particularly challenging fire mission completed under adverse conditions, a battery that held position under attack when retreat was possible, and when recognition comes, it validates all the grinding hardships that came before. The end of a crew member's service, whether through rotation to rear areas, medical discharge, retirement, or death, marks the conclusion of a chapter of the Imperium's endless war. For those who survive to see their service end, the transition back to civilian life, or even to rear echelon military duties, is often difficult. The skills developed in artillery service, the ability to perform under extreme stress, the technical knowledge of weapon systems, the capacity to function on minimal sleep, these have limited applicability in peaceful contexts. Veterans find that civilians cannot understand their experiences, that attempts to describe what artillery service was like fall flat because people without that background simply lack the frame of reference to comprehend. The casual violence, the grinding danger, the loss of friends to arbitrary chance, all of this is alien to those whose greatest daily stress is whether the supply shipment will arrive on time. Veterans often find that they relate better to other veterans than to anyone else, that only those who have served can truly understand what service meant and cost. For many artillery veterans, their hearing damage ensures that the guns never truly fall silent. The tinnitus persists, a constant reminder of their service, the sound of the earthshaker echoing in their ears decades after their last fire mission. Some find this comforting in a strange way, a permanent connection to the proudest period of their lives. Others find it maddening, a curse that prevents them from ever finding peace or silence. The psychological damage is even more persistent than the physical. Veterans carry their war with them, reliving battles in dreams, starting at sudden noises that remind them of incoming fire, scanning the skies for aircraft that exist only in memory. For some, these symptoms fade over time, becoming manageable as the distance from active service increases. For others, they persist indefinitely, constant companions that color every aspect of life after artillery. In the end, the life of a Basilisk artillery crewman is one of service and sacrifice on a scale that most citizens of the Imperium will never comprehend, and which the Imperium itself rarely acknowledges. These soldiers are not the heroes celebrated in propaganda, not the stalwart infantry who hold the line, or the tank commanders who lead breakthrough charges. They are the unglamorous support, the technical specialists whose contribution is measured in tonnage of explosives delivered rather than in dramatic battlefield victories. Yet without them, the Imperium's wars would be unwinnable. Artillery provides the overwhelming firepower that Imperial doctrine depends on, the ability to bring destructive force to bear in quantities that enemy forces cannot match. Every advance, every siege, every major offensive relies on artillery to suppress defenders, to destroy strongpoints, to isolate enemy forces from reinforcement. The infantry and armor get the glory, but the artillery does the work that makes glory possible. The crews who serve these guns endure conditions that would break most people. They work until their bodies fail. They kill at distances where they never see their victims. They accept casualty rates that would be considered unacceptable in any other service. And they do it all with minimal recognition and maximum danger. They are deafened by their weapons, broken by their labor, haunted by their actions, and expected to continue serving until they are killed or injured so severely that they can no longer function. This is the reality behind the thunder, the human cost of every barrage that shakes the battlefield, every rolling bombardment that precedes an infantry advance, every sustained fire mission that reduces enemy positions to smoking craters. The Earthshaker cannon is an inanimate object, steel and hydraulics and propellant, but it is operated by people, by soldiers who chose or were chosen for this service, who live and die at their guns, whose names appear on casualty lists, and whose graves, if they have graves at all, are unmarked holes in contaminated soil on worlds whose names will be forgotten as soon as the war moves elsewhere. Yet they serve. Despite the hardships and despite the lack of recognition, and despite knowing that their service will likely end in death or crippling injury, they serve. They serve because the Imperium demands it, because their oaths require it, because their comrades depend on it, because the alternatives, refusing orders, deserting, failing in their duty, are worse than continuing forward. They serve because they are soldiers of the Astra Militarum, because they are the God Emperor's artillery, because when the word comes down to fire, they will elevate the gun and load the shell and pull the lanyard and send another 38 kilograms of high explosives screaming into the sky. The thunder rolls across the battlefield, the distinctive shriek of Earthshaker shells in flight, and somewhere, many kilometers distant, those shells impact with devastating force. Buildings collapse, fortifications crumble, bodies are torn apart by blast and fragmentation. The crew does not see this. They see only the gun, smoking in its recoil, ready to be loaded again. They hear only the next fire mission being called over the Vox. More coordinates, more adjustments, more shells to be fired. The cycle continues. This is the brutal life of a Basilisk artillery crewman in Warhammer 40k. This is the price of Imperial firepower, the human cost of every barrage, the sacrifice of soldiers who wage war with mathematics and suffer for their service with bodies broken and minds scarred. They are the forgotten soldiers of the Imperium's endless war, the men and women who stand behind the guns and accept that their role is not to be remembered, but simply to keep firing, to maintain the barrage, to ensure that the Emperor's enemies hear his thunder before they die. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, these soldiers serve at the Emperor's guns. They will be forgotten, but the thunder of their weapons will echo across the galaxy, from one war zone to the next, from one generation of crew to the next, for as long as the Imperium endures and enemies threaten mankind's survival. The Earthshaker cannon speaks, and when it does, it speaks with the voices of every crew that has ever served it, every soldier who ever loaded a shell, or adjusted a sight, or pulled the firing lanyard, every man and woman who gave their hearing, their health, their sanity, their life to keep the guns firing. So when you hear that distinctive sound, that rising shriek of incoming artillery, remember that it comes not from a machine but from people. Remember the crews who fired those shells, who calculated those trajectories, who loaded that ammunition while their hands bled, and their ears rang and their bodies screamed for rest that would not come. Remember that every barrage represents not just Imperial firepower, but Imperial sacrifice, measured in soldiers who will never be named, never be celebrated, never be remembered, except as numbers in casualty reports and notations in ammunition expenditure logs. They are the artillery, they are the thunder, and they will continue firing until the war is won or they are dead, whichever comes first. In the Imperium of man, in the grinding, brutal reality of war in the 41st millennium, there is no other option, no other choice, no other fate for those who stand behind the guns. They serve, they suffer, they die, and then they are replaced by the next crew who will serve and suffer and die in their turn. For as long as the Imperium needs artillery and soldiers remain to fire it. This is their story. This is their sacrifice. This is the brutal life of a Basilisk artillery crewman, and it is a story that repeats 1 billion times across 1 million worlds, wherever the Emperor's guns thunder and shells scream through alien skies. If you found this exploration into the brutal reality of artillery service in Warhammer 40k compelling, please like and subscribe to Stories of Hammer for more deep dives into the grim darkness of the far future. We bring you the stories behind the factions, the lives of the soldiers often overlooked in the grand narrative, and the harsh truths of life in the 41st millennium. Until next time, remember that in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and war requires soldiers willing to serve in every role, no matter how brutal, no matter how thankless, no matter the cost.